Picture this. Two babies growing up in the exact same house. We're talking raised side by side, sharing a crib, sharing meals, getting the exact same amount of affection. But there's a catch. One of them was not human. In today's Explainer, we're diving deep into a 1931 study that is it's as fascinating as it is deeply unsettling. Because by the end of this incredibly unique psychological experiment, the scientists running the whole show realized something genuinely chilling. You couldn't always tell which child was which.
So the absolutely crucial question we're exploring today is pretty simple. Which one changed? Now, this isn't some science fiction story or a movie plot. This was a real, published, widely debated study that ultimately ended up being shut down in an absolute panic. And they pulled the plug for a reason literally no one saw coming.
Okay, let's dive into exactly how this happened. Back in 1931, a comparative psychologist named Kellogg wanted to really test the absolute limits of a person's environment. So he brings a 7.5-month-old female chimpanzee named Gua into his family home. But to do this right, he needed a control subject, someone to raise her alongside under the exact same conditions. So he used his own 10-month-old son, Donald. The idea was simple, but honestly pretty extreme. Treat the chimp exactly like the human infant and just see if the chimp becomes humanized.
Now, almost immediately after putting these two together in the same crib, the experiment produced its first massive surprise. And it's a wild one. The chimp was winning. Right from the very jump, the chimpanzee was completely outperforming the human child. To figure that out, both of these infants were put through a really intense testing regimen. For 9 grueling months, it was like a ticking clock. We're talking 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Kellogg's ran both babies through the exact same tests. Could they drink from a cup, open a door, find a hidden treat, respond to their name? They were measuring blood pressure, checking reflexes, testing memory, running these reactions hundreds of times over. And through all of this, Gua took an incredible early lead. She figured out how to drink from a cup way before Donald did. She obeyed commands quicker. She was actually more affectionate, and she even responded to the word no better than the human kid. I mean, imagine being a father and watching your own son lose to a chimpanzee day after day. But Kellogg rationalized it. He knew chimps mature faster biologically, so he just assumed Donald would eventually catch up and pull away. So Kellogg kept going. He was basically waiting for the ultimate test, the one massive barrier he knew that chimp could never, ever cross, the language wall. See, Gua actually understood dozens of words. She could follow spoken instructions perfectly fine, but biologically, a chimpanzee simply cannot speak. Kellogg was just waiting for Donald to start talking. That was going to be the definitive proof of the human spark.
But here is where the tension really starts to ramp up. We have to ask, what happened to Donald's words? Right around 16 months old, a human child is supposed to be building up a vocabulary, right? Saying mama, dada, up, more. But Donald? He only had a tiny handful of words. And worse, he seemed to be losing interest in them altogether. Instead of pulling ahead, the human boy was basically sliding sideways. And this brings us to the twisting punchline of this entire experiment. Actually, scratch that. Donald wasn't just losing interest. When food appeared at the dinner table, Donald didn't ask for it with human words. He grunted for it. He started using the exact same food bark that Gua the chimpanzee used. He was learning her language, not his. The experiment triggered this completely unsettling reversal. Donald didn't just stop talking. He started crawling like Gua, even though he already knew how to walk. He was copying her chimpanzee sounds, mimicking her ape expressions, even copying the way she greeted people. The boy was studying the chimp and imitating her way more than she was imitating him. Kellogg totally proved his theory that environment shapes the child. He just proved it in the completely wrong direction. Because of this massive regression, everything came to a screeching halt on March 28, 1932. Exactly 9 months in, the Kellogg's pulled the plug. And look, they didn't stop the study to protect the chimpanzee. They had to make a really hard choice between a fascinating, career-defining experiment and their own son's development. They shut the whole thing down to protect the boy before any permanent damage set in.
But the fallout from that decision was honestly pretty tragic. To stop the experiment, they had to take Gua, who, remember, had lived as their daughter for 9 months, and send her away to a primate colony, right back to cages with chimps she didn't even understand. Sadly, less than 2 years later, in 1933, Gua died of pneumonia. She was barely 3 years old. She never got to be a real chimp, and she obviously wasn't allowed to stay human.
As for Donald, well, he did recover. He didn't grow up to be an ape. In this incredibly ironic twist of fate, he actually went on to Harvard Medical School and became a psychiatrist. Think about that. He spent his entire life studying the human mind, after being the literal subject of an experiment about it. But tragically, in 1973, Donald took his own life at age 42, shortly after both of his parents passed away. Now, I want to be absolutely 100% clear here. No researcher has ever proven a causal link between this experiment and his death. People grieve in devastating ways, and it may have had absolutely nothing to do with his childhood alongside Gua.
But that tragic ending really refuses to let the core question of this experiment rest. Are we born human, or are we made human? It's the ultimate nature versus nurture debate, right? But framed in a way that is so far from some dry textbook lesson. The experiment was designed to answer this exact question, but the honest answer it gave was far, far stranger than anyone could have anticipated.
The researchers walked away with a chilling realization. A chimp raised as a human got incredibly far, but eventually hit a biological wall that she just couldn't cross. Yet, the human child, raised beside a chimp, drifted toward the animal with such ease that it literally terrified his own parents. The line between us and the animal isn't a solid wall, it's a habit. And habits, as we've seen, can be learned in either direction.
Which leaves us right back where we started, but with a completely new perspective. Two babies grew up in that house. One was sent back to a cage and died young. The other grew up to study the very mind that the experiment used him to test. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. Which one really changed?